Okay, thank you for viewing this presentation. This is based on a presentation I did at the Perf.NET user group here in Australia last week, and I just thought I'd re-record it as I accidentally deleted the previous version just to try and get some feedback on this from a wider community. So what we're going to try and cover today is how ASP.NET developers can leverage SharePoint. This is a common thing that comes up, and I kind of re-enhanced the debate just recently on the SharePoint Dev Wiki. And also from encouragement from some of the guys at Microsoft here in Australia to try and present this at the Perf.NET community, because obviously I'm more frequently known in the SharePoint community, and just to try and see if we can win over a few more of these ASP.NET characters into the SharePoint development world. So what I'm going to cover today is obviously an introduction to this area, and also how ASP.NET developers can leverage it and why they should. But then also cover off some misconceptions around SharePoint outside of the SharePoint community. But also, I want to be kind of very upfront in terms of what the current issues are around leveraging SharePoint, so that people don't just get this full bottle view of SharePoint being the resolution for everything, and also some limitations around the out-of-the-box areas, just to be a bit aware of a few things. But then, and to finish off, I just want to state some kind of concepts where you should really be sticking to ASP.NET and not really touching SharePoint. And then I'll wrap it all up. So just as an introduction to get started, some of the feedback I was getting from the community was around the fact that what makes the decisions around ASP.NET development. And some of the key things I just kept hearing were around the speed and how fast development is. So not only in terms of how fast it is to compile the projects, but also in terms of how the IDE, the integrated development environment, works, and how fast and responsive that is on a minute by minute basis. You're not clicking here and waiting 10 minutes for a design surface to turn up. It's very instant. So those kind of things in a short term, they add up over a week's work. But also, as well as the development experience, in terms of the end performance of that code once it's in production or once it's in test. And also once it's running in development as well, because again, that can have implications as well. Excuse me. The big thing that also came up was around handling complex solutions, and also the key area was the ability to debug, because a lot of ASP.NET developers are very used to stepping through code currently in the way they work, and they don't want this taken away from them to have to start looking at maybe a tracing type route instead of being able to just step through code, which is obviously a lot quicker to rig up. And the big thing, and I think this is from experience with other platforms, is around how easy it is to learn. So how simple the API is, and whether the methods and the objects are very easy to digest and be obvious in terms of what they're actually doing, and also in terms of the resources out there for that platform, because there's a lot of platforms out there that are very large enterprise platforms, but in terms of the community and online resources, it is very, very light on, and the only way you really learn these platforms is from being in the deep end in a large project, or by going on a vendor-based training program, which can be very expensive, and sometimes clients just don't want to pay for that if you're going to be a consultant in it. So, as I said before, I had actually started a page on the SharePoint Dev Wiki, which, if you're in the SharePoint community, I hope you already are aware of. But if you're not, then this is something that I've been formed in December of 2008 to try and encourage SharePoint people to collaborate in a central area, as opposed to writing stuff in silos on their blog where things don't evolve over time and you only seem to find them via search. So this is a very good example of it, where the table of pros and cons for SharePoint development platform, as a development platform, have been put forward. And there's been comments and discussions below in the list, which I'll let you digest in your own time. But effectively, this presentation does cover a lot of this stuff. And again, I'd be really interested in your opinions as we go through this presentation and afterwards, and putting it up on that wiki page as well. That'd be great. So one of the key things I've realized is that there's the awareness of SharePoint and there's a lot of misconceptions out there. So what I wanted to try and do with this presentation was clear up some of those things and just to educate people on what you can actually do with SharePoint. So rather than hearing the spiel from SharePoint sales guys and the like, I actually wanted to say, well, how is this practically going to be used by an ASP.NET developer? You know, where is this really feasible and where is it just sales talk? One clear thing that I got from this is that there is this immense hatred out there for SharePoint with some no good reasons. You ask some of these guys why they hate it and they can't give a reason, they just do. And maybe they've heard Bob down the road talk about it and they just kind of, it's the whole bully gang thing. I don't take offense, I have my days with SharePoint. I'm sure everyone does with every platform. But it's just one of those things, but please see this webcast with the open eyes to at least try and take on board some of the things I'm going to pitch. Often the excuse for hating it is it's not open source. Well, there's a lot of platforms out there that aren't open source which are leveraged by the enterprise, so I don't personally see why that's going to be an issue. The whole open source debate is, I don't want to discuss that here, but there's plenty of other wikis out there that discuss that in more detail. The key thing I got from my Redify colleagues was around frameworks in general, not just SharePoint, but just in terms of frameworks. And the fact that traditionally frameworks are over-engineered because they do try and be generic for all situations. This is especially so with SharePoint on a larger scale with the MOS, which I'll discuss in a minute, because it does try and cover off so much functionality within the enterprise. One other area other than over-engineering was around dependencies that frameworks have, and again I'll discuss that in more detail in a minute. The key thing I also found was around developers tend to like to write things themselves, and the best scenario or explanation for this was around the fact that a lot of time worked on with a platform is actually working out what the platform does, how you actually get it to do what you want it to do, as opposed to just simply writing it yourself. Now, there are a lot of developers out there in terms of proof of concepts where they believe that they find it quicker to write these things themselves than they do actually leverage off a platform that does it. Now, I tend to disagree with this. I think that's more around education and knowing the right times to use a platform and having the tools there to actually be able to implement it and leverage it. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll start to see where these things fit in. So SharePoint actually is based on or it leverages the ASP.NET framework, which again sits on top of Internet Information Services version 6, which is part of the Windows Server 2003 feature pack. Now it does obviously run on Server 2008 and iOS 7, and you can tweak it so that it runs on top of .NET 3.5 and also once ASP.NET 4 comes out, you'll be able to run it on top of that as well. But just simply the stuff that the platform targets will be part of those libraries that are currently on in 2.0. The Windows SharePoint Service is the first layer around ASP.NET to do with SharePoint, and this is a free version of SharePoint that is available. When I say free, it's available as part of the Windows Server license. And then there's the Microsoft Office SharePoint Server 2003, which is a paid-for license, which is separate from Windows Server. So, I guess in terms of how we can leverage it, the first thing you need to know is what you need to leverage it. So, as I've just mentioned, you're going to need Windows Server, so you've got IIS and ASP.NET Framework. You're also going to need Visual Studio 2005 or 8, and SharePoint stores all of its information inside a SQL database, so you're going to need some sort of SQL engine, whether it's Express, Standard, or Enterprise, and obviously 2005 or 2008. Now, you may already say, well, we've probably already got that, because ASP.NET obviously it's going to be leveraging IIS, so you're going to need Windows Server. You'd be hard pushed to be writing ASP.NET development websites without Visual Studio, and most ASP.NET developments I've always worked on have had a SQL backend. So most times you've already got the kit there to start running SharePoint. So that's one thing to bear in mind, which is pretty compelling. So I guess this is the kind of the blunt part of it in terms of why we use it. Well, as I've mentioned before, WS is free. Most enterprises own MOS via enterprise CALs or the enterprise agreements. So sometimes it's already there for you to leverage. It's just you may not be aware that they've actually got licenses for it. Um, it's a The key things for me to take home are these 4 points, is that it's a common user interface. So for me that means a few things. It means you've got a UI framework that you can build off straight away. It also means from an end user perspective, because it's common, the training involved in teaching people kind of the nuances around how to use the environment are a lot simpler. So once you've trained someone to use the timesheet system, it might be very easy for them to use the annual leave submission system. The other key thing is there's a core framework there, which I'll discuss in more detail. For the similar types of arguments there, is that rather than every time you do an ASP.NET development, you go out there and you try and rewrite the last version of this core framework that you'd customly built, you're actually leveraging off a base platform which has a lot of rich functionality in there. Now the beauty of that is that it's not just your organisation that's going to have that IP and that framework. That framework's available to other enterprises nationally and worldwide. So looking for developers who have the understanding of that framework is going to be a lot easier than it is to try and support your own custom built frameworks. So where you can, it's very compelling to use common frameworks that are built by enterprises such as Microsoft, as opposed to getting a contractor in to write their own framework and walk away, and then you've got to maintain it forever. The same can be said for the data layer. The other key thing which is important is disaster recovery. Now a lot of effort is taken into support teams transitioning ASP.NET websites into their backup disaster recovery scenarios. Because SharePoint is one overlying platform, if your solutions are running with it and you have disaster recovery for SharePoint, if you're developing your systems properly, you're actually getting disaster recovery for free because it's already encapsulated within SharePoint. Now, in some extreme cases, this won't be true, but typically this is a very compelling reason for development managers to leverage platforms, because you get that double win once you start rolling out multiple solutions on the SharePoint platform. So one of the other very compelling reasons is that SharePoint already leverages the ASP.NET platform in itself. So most ASP.NET developers, we're across those things on the screen in terms of the IIS, web applications and application pools. Everyone's tinkered with the web.config files and they'd be using Visual Studio IDE already. But on top of that, with the release of SharePoint 2007, based on Windows SharePoint Services version 3, they started to leverage off the master pages, page layouts, and web parts which came available within the ASP.NET 2 framework. Now, this is a very clever, and it's actually a very good example of how master pages and page layouts can be leveraged within the ASP.NET platform. So if anyone's done any work around that, the learning curve around how SharePoint's built up and how different sites can be created and customized will become very easy for them. It also allows developers to leverage user controls and site themes, which are also quite a common thing leveraged within the ASP.NET development space. So with those things in mind, if you're across those things already, you're already onto a winner with SharePoint development. What I will say though is if you're new to all of those things, SharePoint development really does require you to understand those fundamentals first. And I think where people go wrong when they're learning SharePoint is they try and jump in straight into SharePoint development and understanding the platform and the framework without understanding the platform and the framework that it sits on top of, e.g. ASP.NET. So that's just one thing to bear in mind. Another side of it, which obviously you have to be fairly familiar with, is XHTML markup, and obviously JavaScript and CSS help as well. So again, without these core skills, you're really going to struggle with SharePoint, I suspect, with the development side. But if you are powerful in those things, it's definitely going to be something you're going to be able to leverage and pick up a lot quicker than you probably expect to. So what I wanted to just show you here was just a development environment I'm running. I'm running Windows Server 2008, and what I've actually got here is a Central Administration Console, which is a common web UI for SharePoint, whether it's MOS or WSS. And essentially what SharePoint runs as I've explained in the diagrams, is just a set of IIS web applications and application pools. Now, the important thing to understand with SharePoint is that it is geared towards a very big deployment story in terms of how big your farms get. So typically in a production environment, in an ASP.NET application, you may have 2 to 3 web front-end load balance servers. What SharePoint allows you to do is create that web application once within central administration, and SharePoint will actually handle all your deployment for you in terms of provisioning those web applications within IIS on each individual server, but without you having to log in and create all those things. So the deployment story is very strong from that perspective. It also means that if you then want to deploy a change to the web.config or deploy files to that web application, rather than logging into each individual box and doing this, SharePoint via the central administration console will actually deploy those for you. So if we look in here now at the typical SharePoint setup, you'll actually see that there's various sites that have been created, and all of these sites have been provisioned via SharePoint. And you can see here that there's various things that I've worked on in terms of in this environment with, and they've been separated by port numbers. And each of them has their associated application pool provided by them. Now you don't actually use IIS to create those. You actually come in here into the application tab within Central Admin, and you provision them here. The reason you provision them within SharePoint in Central Admin is that this then goes away and it has an understanding of what other SharePoint servers are included within its own farm. So if you're going to create another web application, you'll actually be able to provision this directly to all of those servers. So if I come in here and click create. Now, one of the things to bear in mind is that you can actually do all this stuff in the SharePoint Web UI, but you can also do everything you can in the Web UI programmatically using a tool called STS-ADM. What this allows you to do is automate these things. So in a brand new environment, you can automate creating 10 websites, or deleting 10 websites, or modifying a website programmatically. So you can see here there's various settings you can set. So I'm just going to call this one a test, and you can see that the authentication provider can be designated here, and anonymous access, all the typical things that you'd probably do within IIS, but it's just wrapped up within the SharePoint platform. And you can see here that you can even have things like your load balance URL. So if you had DNS entries for URLs, you can apply that here. And also you can associate yourself with a separate application pool, which is is very highly recommended. So you can see here that I can put in the accounts, and I can even control whether IIS is going to be restarted. And also in terms of the database server that's going to be used to store the content database, which stores all of the artifacts and content that's stored within that site. Now this will go away now and provision that. Now because this is the development server, it's just a single server farm, but you can imagine now that was 4 or 5 load web front-end servers that will be going away and provisioning all those servers, all those applications on all those servers for you. Once you have your IIS web application created, you can then go and create what's called a site collection. Now the site collection is kind of your base for your SharePoint instance, and depending on the different ways you want to architect this, you can do various different approaches. For the purposes of demo, I'm just going to demonstrate creating a blank web Windows Services site template, just to show you how this can be done via the Web UI. Now again, this can be done in the Web UI, but it can also be done in the command line. So now that's actually created that web application, i.e. the IIS web app inside here, we actually now need to create a SharePoint instance within that, and these are called site collections. So I'm just going to create that site collection. Now this is where it kind of gets a bit more customizable, which is something you wouldn't be able to do on top of IIS on its own, because you're actually starting to get some of the power of SharePoint in here, other than just the provisioning of IIS. So again, use the famous test. But what you can see here is I can allocate it the web application, so I can go in here and pick other ones if I wish. And again, you can start doing things like picking the URL. So if I didn't want it at the root, I could then go in here and put the test down there if I really liked. But for now, I'm going to put this one at the root. Now the power in here is once I have designated this site collection to a particular user, so I can actually go in and pick from what's called a site template. What this allows me to do is provide a base for what my SharePoint site collection will look like in terms of what lists are available and the look and feel and different bits and pieces in terms of web parts and pages that are available. So from a product perspective, this is very powerful, but also from a scenario where you've got a common kind of collaboration scenario, this can be very strong, and this is what SharePoint is probably best known for. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to create the basic team site. And again, you can have quotas on these things so that they don't blow out, and you get warnings. Your administrators get warnings if there's more than 50 meg or 100 meg of documents in these things. So now this has been top level site's been created, I can then actually now visit this site. So now that's loaded up, you can see now that it's got that typical look of SharePoint, which you can see. But don't be any disillusioned, that's not the case, and there's plenty of sites out there which I'll show you that don't look anything like SharePoint but are run on that base platform. But I just wanted to give you an idea that that this is just an ASP.NET web app. It's running in an IIS web application pool within a web application on a Windows Server 2003 machine. So this is very typical to what you would be used to inside a. The other thing that is key to why you would use this is the underlying framework. Now, one of the key things, or the most powerful things I've found with SharePoint, is the security around it, in terms of the fact that you have this security trimming. The security trimming works across the entire web UI. So if you have a link, for instance, where on the right hand side I decided that only Bob could see that shared documents library, I can actually come into that list there and set the permissions on that list so that only Bob can see it. And what that will actually do is it will basically hide that link from anyone who logs into the site who isn't Bob. So you get this immediate gain that your UI is security trimmed for the user in context. Now this is very powerful, and often security is kind of left to the very last minute with most implementations in ASP.NET traditionally, from my experience. The fact that the security is that easy to the framework's there from the UI perspective and also in the API perspective as well in the back end, is that it makes it very easy to account for security up front and make it as part of the initial process, as opposed to being kind of the poor last part of the iterations of the Agile or waterfall project that you do. So you can see here that this is a SharePoint list, which I'll talk about later on in a bit more detail, but most things have options or settings off them, and items at the site level but also at the list level, and the actual items within the list can all have permissions on them. So inside your list settings, you can actually see that it has the permissions for that document library. So what I can do in here is this is actually inheriting, and you'll see here that it's inheriting from its parent web, which is what the list belongs to, and that web will inherit from the site collection. But what we can actually do is, if we wanted to, we could come in here and say, well, we can either break the inheritance and make this list kind of custom security, or you can actually go and change the web to say, well, I want the entire site that this is viewed to have particular permissions on it. And again, the UI adheres to it. And even if someone tries to come in via the web service or the API and add documents into this list programmatically, the security is applied at that level too. So I find that quite a compelling, common thing that's required from a solution that you're developing. The other powerful thing that I found with SharePoint is that the framework is very component based. So where we've just said before around WSS being the base layer on top of ASP.NET and MOS being the secondary layer around WSS, is this the same kind of thing is applied for the components and how that's developed by things called features. So there's this folder called the 12 Hive, and I don't want to go into too much detail here, but what I wanted to just show was the fact that inside the this 12 Hive is this concept of features, which effectively are components. So you can see here that there are various different folders that actually have detailed areas in them. So you may have heard of My Sites before, which is part of a MOS feature set. Now in a WSS farm, this folder wouldn't be here. But because this is a MOS farm, this feature is actually installed in here and is available. And both the feature XML file and its child manifest file contain all of the declarative information on what that component does. So if you build your own solutions, you basically use the same method. Again, with most frameworks you'll have logging, so the logging you can hook into the existing built-in logging very easily, and it saves you using a third-party component, which, again, it's one less thing to have to worry about. The other beauty of it is that although you're dealing with lists and adding items to lists and deleting items from a list and editing items from a list, all the persistence is handled for you by the API, so you don't have to worry about your SQL story at all, because you're purely dealing with the API or the web UI or the web services to interact with that persistence layer. And again, because of the fact that we discussed before, you can have a SharePoint farm of multiple servers. There's a lot of architectural stuff that's kind of is governed for you by central administration. But also at a site collection site level, you can also start getting into a hierarchy of an architecture at that level too, which the framework provides. On top of the component-based feature side of things, SharePoint also is extremely extendable because it is based on a .NET framework, and a lot of the patterns used within the API can be extended, and there's plenty of examples of that on the SharePoint Dev Wiki and other resources on the website. The common thing I find with ASP.NET Web Apps is that typically you spend a lot of your time, or a few iterations at least, having a system where you want to be able to upload related documents to do with a solution that you're building for a client. Now SharePoint is going to give you that for free by being able to create these file libraries for you, and again you'll be able to access them via web services, via the API directly, and you can even start integrating your solutions within those libraries as opposed to it being like an afterthought or a secondary addition. So I find there's quite compelling reasons. So just to give you an idea of how those components do work within an environment, if I come in here into my site and go into my site settings for this site, you'll see that if I go, there's features here at this level. Now you'll see how I've got a few different things I can activate in here, and all these things are components that I've created, and I can actually activate these things. So for instance, Joe Tellins has a jQuery add-on feature, which effectively just activates jQuery within this site collection via modifying the page layout and the master pages, and giving it available some JavaScript files that are obviously common across the entire farm. So all you need to do to activate this feature is just click to activate, and you'll see that that's immediately activated that stuff. Now if I went into the site now and had a look at the source code, and I probably should have shown you this before and after, is you'll now see that I get this jQuery Smart Tools addition. Now the way that SharePoint works is that these things can be turned off and turned on. Now in certain circumstances, SharePoint by design, even if you do a deactivation, will kill those. In this instance, when I deactivate, you'll see that if I do a find and replace, that jQuery is now gone. So you can turn things on and turn things off in a very powerful way across site collections. Now typically this is how you would start looking at building products or building components for reuse, and hopefully you can see the kind of the compelling reasons around how powerful that framework can be for development. The crux of SharePoint for me really is the SharePoint lists. Now as I said before, there's a lot of times where you have to store data, and you don't want to have to worry about this whole stack of writing SQL schemas and having to write store procedures, and then a data layer to then consume those store procedures, and then maybe business objects on top of that. The approach SharePoint takes is that you can actually create all these things via the web UI, and immediately by creating this list, which is effectively like a SQL table, you can have this whole create, read, update, delete, CRUD type approach to things. But with that, you get the ability of having instant access to the web services, to the API directly that you can manipulate via via Visual Studio, and we can also start looking at extending the SharePoint list as well. So when we have a look at this shared documents list, you can see that there's various things we can do. Now the first thing, obviously, I kind of like to demonstrate is the whole concept of views. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to first create a blank list. Now remember, everything you can do in the UI, you can do programmatically using the API or declaratively using XML in certain instances as well. So I'm just going to create a custom list now, and I'll just keep using my famous test. Now immediately you get a list here with just title in here. But again, we can come in here and have a look at the settings, and I can just create a new thing in here, and I'm just going to create a body thing, and we can create the site column has various types and various settings for it. Now if I go back up to here, you'll see that now has adapted the UI for me based on all that. So whereas with SQL, if we change the schema, you would then have to go and reflect that in the store procedure in your data access layer, and then in your business objects, and then UI. SharePoint's done all that for you, which is very powerful. You can also then customize it further. So I can go and customize this view or create multiple views for me to use. So if I customize this view, I might say, well, in that view I don't want to show that body field, I just want to show the title. But what I might want to do is create a new view, and I pick standard view for now, and you might say let's call that the test view, and in this view I want the body, but what I want to do is I want to actually group by a particular field. So we're going to group by a content type, and then what we can also do is do things like show only where the title is equal to test. Click OK. So you can see straight away there that the UI is very powerful in terms of those views. So if I now create a test item and create a test one item, you'll see that there's only showing that one view, which is this one. But then if I look at all items, it's going to show me both without a group by. So you can get a very powerful, rich UI interface extremely quickly. And again, all of this that you can do in the web UI can be reverse engineered with tools such as Solution Generator and also ASP Storage, which I've helped contribute some efforts towards. So hopefully that's give you a bit of an idea that you can see here that you get all your CRUD, you've got your edit forms, you've got your new forms, you've got the ability to delete off the UI, and you've got the ability to manage your permissions. But powerful things that you also get is in terms of your RSS. So you imagine a client asks you, oh, we want this, we want a data table created in SQL, and we want to store timesheets for individuals, and we want to be able to group those timesheets by users, and then we want to be able to consume those via RSS. They get all that for free straight away out of the box with SharePoint. So for me, those kind of things are very compelling in terms of the stuff you get without even having to worry about it. Now, as well as those things we briefly mentioned, we had security at that item level, but we also get the versioning as well. So I can go and change the metadata there and track and view the versioning between the items. And I've covered off views. The event handlers are essentially, there's various hooks you can have into each list in terms of when an item's added, when an item's edited, or when it's deleted, and you can do various things like cancel that action, or you can go and trigger different things. So might have a timesheet that's added, and it might go and send an email to your manager to say that timesheet's added, or talk to an external payroll system to ensure that those times are updated there. All those things can be added as hooks within those lists. The workflow packages in SharePoint actually leverage that. So you can have a workflow that's kicked off when you add an item. And there's various workflows you get out of the box, but you can also write your own using Windows Workflow Foundation services as well. On top of that, SharePoint comes with an extremely powerful search engine, which is available site collection wide with WSS and more powerfully with Moss. What this allows you to do is do things that are commonly asked by solutions with businesses, is in terms of being able to search for items that you've entered in those lists. So rather than having to write some complex query in SQL and then map that through to a store procedure and map that through to data layer and business layer and up to UI, all those things are given you for free. Again, along with things like a recycle bin and the ability to do things like when I can send an email to that list and it strips out the attachments of the email and adds those items directly to that list. Those things for me are extremely powerful ways to leverage the SharePoint platform. So just to give you a bit of an idea of how all this is swinging together, because I've mentioned before this is all stored in a database, SharePoint does actually come with a virtual file system. So I use a tool called SharePoint Manager 2007, which is by Carsten Koopman. And what this tool does is it gives me a visual representation of the object model for this instance of the site. So you can see here that if I look at my test site, which is on 47046, which is here, that's my site collection and that's my URL, and you can see immediately all the settings that can be done at that level for that object. But I can drill down into the root web, which is for that site collection, and I can drill into the lists, and you'll see here that I've got my test list. And inside here I have items, and you can see here is my test item and my test 1 item. So you can get a very good understanding of how this object model is working, and immediately this starts to map towards areas of the API that you can develop against as well. So this is virtual. All of this stuff is stored within the content database. None of this is stored in file system. The stuff I showed you before in the 12 Hive file is across all site collections and web applications, whereas your content, which is stored per site collection, is stored in a database, and this basically gives you that virtual file system here. Now, if anyone's done in the ASP .NET development in the past with web parts, you'll be very familiar with these things. And again, this is purely leveraging ASP .NET 2.0 as well. But it's a very compelling feature of SharePoint in terms of what you can do here. So if I come into my stock standard page and go up to the top here, you can see that I have various websites here. So there's one there and a calendar one here. And what you can actually do is come in here and go edit page, and I can start adding web parts to here. So you'll see that I've got that test list there, and what that'll actually allow me to do is add a dashboard view of that test list, and I can start customizing this web part via properties. So I can pick the view I want, so I can go and pick that test view I created, and I can say things like I want this to be called the test web part in my title, and that I want the Chrome to just have the title only without any of this extra bits and pieces on it. So when I click OK and I click exit, you'll see that I don't get the extra Chrome that I would have got when I selected those other settings. And you can see straight away that I've got this group by, just like I did on the other page. So web parts give you a very powerful way of being able to build these dashboards and these views of different things. And again, just like you can do in ASP.NET 2.0, you can start connecting these web parts. So I can select a list here, which then, if I clicked on a radio box here, would actually drive web parts also on the page as well in context. So those kind of things are great for those solutions you build where they're very dynamic across data. So I touched on deployment lightly in terms of how it provisions web applications and the site collections and everything to various servers within a SharePoint farm. But the other powerful tool is around deployment in terms of getting those components I mentioned as features into the farm itself. These are called solution packages, and the file extension, which you probably heard if you've heard anything around SharePoint, is a WISP file, a WSP file. Now, what this will allow me to do is package up all of the dependent files I require, and any web config changes I need to make happen, DLLs that need to go into the GAC, into that environment. So again, when it comes to a situation where you've got 3 front-end servers, you deploy that solution package once into the farm, and then you can then the SharePoint will actually deploy that directly into your environments without you having to worry. And all of this is managed from within a central administration page in the web UI. I didn't want to go too much into the Moss side of things because it's covering a lot of SharePoint, and there's a lot of better webcasts that do this, and articles. But essentially, there's quite a lot of features within Moss that you get at varying degrees of additions. So wherever you're doing anything with web content management or document management, or if you want to hit grab information from a SQL or third-party web service, or your own web services, you can do things like the business data catalog. You can also expose Excel spreadsheets via the web UI, but also have them hosted in SharePoint and then access them via the API as well, using Excel services. And obviously there's a lot of enterprise search stuff there, and my sites, which are probably the easiest way to explain is Facebook for the enterprise. So all those different features come with Moss, but just as a bit of a a hint that you don't need all of these things to leverage SharePoint's platform, because obviously Moss is based on WSS, and all those things are discussed around lists and solution packages and everything are all capable of being able to be done without the Moss implementations. So getting down to the nitty-gritty in terms of the misconceptions of SharePoint, I wanted just to cover a few things which I've had discussed with me over the various few months when I've been raising these things in user groups. One of the things was around debugging. Debugging is hard. Is really a false claim, because at the end of the day, as long as you're in a server environment and you're developing SharePoint, and you've got the ability to attach to the worker process IIS application pool like you would normally do in ASP .NET applications, then there's no problems. I think where it comes into light is because it's a server platform, you don't have the ease of use of just creating a brand new ASP.NET web application project, clicking F5 and putting a breakpoint and it firing Cassini for you and going in straight that quick. So yes, it is going to be slightly slower for you than it is with Cassini, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's hard. The deployment is bad. Now, I've already just discussed with you the whole component side of things and the solution package side of things and the provision of iOS web apps, so hopefully that's proved that one wrong without me having to go any further with that. Skinning is hard is another area where I just think maybe it's just the limitations in terms of people's knowledge of CSS and ASP.NET, because there's plenty of very impressive sites out there which show much more detail what's capable. And some of these sites are located on this topsharepoint.com site, which actually has a community kind of fed rating system on it as well. So there's plenty of sites in here which have lots and lots of non-SharePoint UI look and feel to it, which typically have leverage WSS, but then there are also some leverages Moss web content management system stuff, but there's also plenty of WS sites out there too. So just bear that in mind when you're thinking about SharePoint stuff. It's not going to be maybe as easy as skinning some of the other very low-end systems out there, but because it's master pages, page layouts and CSS, there's plenty of ways of making these things skinnable as well. But you just need to understand how that architecture and frameworks hangs together to do it properly. The other thing that I get quite a bit is, it's really bad because you can only deploy the DLLs to the GAC. Now the GAC obviously is your assembly folder within your Windows, and typically when you're doing ASP.NET development, you tend to put your DLLs in the bin folder within your IONET pub of your IIS application. Now, the GAC isn't the only place you can put these DLLs. You can deploy your DLLs to the bin directory. The question being is whether you really need to do that and what the issues are that people have around the GAC. I tend to think this is another one around it's not open source argument where they can't give me a compelling reason why they don't want these things in the GAC. So I tend to see that as a misconception, also an understanding that you can get around from doing the GAC if you wish to. Again, with the expensive thing, we've already proved, or I've already discussed today, around the fact that you've most likely already got SQL in your environment, and you're definitely going to have an IIS web application to run your ASP.NET web apps. So in terms of expense, I don't think there is any in terms of using WSS. Obviously there's licensing costs involved in having a Moss license, but you don't have to have that Moss license to leverage the SharePoint platform. With the client-side no client-side validation, which I seem to get quite a bit, there are plenty of articles out there on how you can leverage jQuery to add additional client-side validation, but there's plenty of validation available or out of the box with the CRUD type list interface that you get when you're creating columns, and you can set validation on your fields there. And again, we've already discussed that because SharePoint's web applications are based on ASP.NET, you can happily go in there and you can add the AJAX commands and the 3.5 .NET framework areas to your web config and immediately get access to all of that framework goodness that you don't get when you automatically switch SharePoint on. And there are even solution packages that leverage the framework which will do all that for you in an automatic way across your farm as well. So there's been a lot of work done by the community to help with these things. With the it's hard to migrate existing ASP.NET web apps, again, I've seen plenty of people go out there and actually take on how they've currently written things as master pages and page layouts with web parts, added the various SharePoint controls in there, and they've happily got it running within SharePoint, where they can then start leveraging the framework of SharePoint on top of their existing apps. Again, this does depend on the complexity of your ASP.NET web application and how it's been architected. So being extremely blunt on what the issues are that are around leveraging SharePoint, I've already discussed that it does require a server development environment, which means you're not going to get the speed of a Cassini client-based development environment that you would get with ASP.NET. SharePoint is an extremely complex framework. You can see from the list of what I've discussed already today, this is, I'm only touching the very surface with this framework. So it is extremely complex, and I do agree to a certain degree that to sometimes get things working, you do have to understand SharePoint at various levels of the framework to get things to hook together. But again, the beauty of this is it's a common, internationally recognized framework, which means that you can leverage off the existing community, you can find new resources a lot easier than you can someone who writes you a convoluted ad hoc version of that framework. WSS does have its limits from a scalability point of view, and Microsoft have done that by design to try and push you into the MOS additions. But again, for proof of concepts and to get your first few solutions across the line, I believe that WSS is more than capable. If you're looking to make this your platform of choice across your enterprise, then I would strongly recommend that you move to a MOS environment for that. One thing I have found, and talking to various people around the traps, is that troubleshooting some of the security areas can be an absolute headache. Now there are tools out there to circumvent that, but as I've described or demonstrated today in terms of applying security at a web level, at a site collection level, at a list level, and at a list item level, it can get hard to track down why a particular user can't see these things. No more so than what it's like when you're looking at, say for instance, the same kind of scenarios you would get if you were doing row-based SQL security or file system security on your NAS servers. An area we haven't really touched today is around the CAML markup. Now, it's the collaborative application markup language, and that's used by the API web services to essentially give you a SQL query-like approach to going, get me the list items where title equals this and content type equals this. So you just have to bear in mind that sometimes that can be a bit hard, but there are tools such as the U2U CAML builder that can help you in those approaches. Now, one of the biggest limitations and one of the main reasons that you have to use a server development environment for SharePoint is because the .NET object model is actually a COM wrapper around a COM object which is from the legacy SharePoint 2.0 platform. This does mean that there are security implications of trying to run the DLLs, and also architectural implications of trying to run the SharePoint DLLs on a client machine, because it does expect those COM objects to be there, so don't expect you to be able to hack that around that. There are plenty of ways of trying to install SharePoint onto XP and Vista and Win 7. I would strongly recommend against that for various obvious reasons around the fact that it's not designed to do it. One of the horror stories some of the horror stories I've seen around SharePoint is the fact that unfortunately SharePoint is very easy to install in the environment, but also can lead to very devastating things down the path. It's like anything, you can probably build an apple cart and roll down a hill in it, but if you were going to try and drive thousands of k's, you'd probably want to go and buy a car and not use that apple cart. For short distances it's going to be fine, but for long distances it's going to drive you insane, and obviously you're probably going to you're not going to get to your end destination. I think that's very much the case with building these environments in the first place. Please read the documentation thoroughly before you do this. The one that I will kind of say is incorrect, which is again misconception, but so many people say it's an issue, is around accessibility. Now yes, it is an issue, but this isn't SharePoint's issue. There's accessibility issues around ASP.NET platform as a whole, which haven't been looked at until ASP.NET 4.0, which comes out next year. So just bear in mind that when people start talking about accessibility in SharePoint, even if you did this as an ASP.NET web app, you'd still have to get around those issues because SharePoint inherits from the platform it wraps itself around. Now, there are various issues with web content management, and if you want to look into the web content management approach with SharePoint, then I would strongly recommend that you go out and buy Andrew Connell's book, which is linked on the SharePoint Dev Wiki and obviously it's available via Amazon. It's a very good book. It covers how you should be implementing WCM. The biggest issues I've seen with it is people just not understanding how it's been architected and just attacking it as if it's like a normal standard WCM. It does have a few nuances you have to get used to, and Andrew Connell's book does a great example of explaining all that. Remember that it is Microsoft Content Management Server and it's been migrated into this, so just bear that in mind because some of the things that have come across from it are from those MCMS days. There's some great webcasts based on the westernaustralia.com.au website that local Perth guys have done, which are available from my blog. So please have a look through those. And again, there's plenty of information on some of the other limitations in a series on my blog where you can get a bit more of an understanding in terms of those things. So in my articles on the SharePoint magazine, which Arno Nell runs, who's an MVP based in the UK, and also there's a kind of compelling series of articles here on SharePoint development as well. So you just might want to have a look at those. So just to kind of finish off with, I've talked up SharePoint quite a bit there and talked about its limitations and stuff to just to look out for. If you are looking for a very fast client development environment, then really you have to stick with ASP.NET. There are issues around trying to provision server development environments, whether it be licenses for these servers or whether it be for the actual physical hardware to run them, whether it be you run them on a laptop or whether you run them on virtual environments, that there are administration and overheads in creating these things. Because of that, it's a lot easier to configure on ASP.NET. So if you've got a very short turnaround and you've never done a SharePoint project before, I wouldn't recommend trying to do that and adding that risk. From a complexity point of view, ASP.NET is a lot simpler because it doesn't have WSS and MOS wrapped around it. As I said earlier on in the presentation, you really do need to understand ASP.NET to quite a detailed degree because of the way it leverages that platform. So throwing junior devs at something when they haven't even got ASP.NET experience is not going to be a good idea. One other thing to bear in mind is that there's going to be a lot of features in ASP.NET 4.0 which SharePoint won't have in it because it only leverages 2.0 at the minute. Now you can, as you can with 3.5 currently, add those to the web config and leverage those, but I imagine that once 4.0 comes out there'll be a few things that are going to be a bit sticky around SharePoint to actually get them to work. So if you're looking for 4.0 compatibility stuff, you may want to do some proof of concept to make sure those things are all going to hang together and work nicely with SharePoint. The ASP.NET community has been around for a lot longer than SharePoint, and therefore, maybe not as long, but tends to be larger because of the fact of the reach it has within a Microsoft community. So again, I see that as an advantage to stick with ASP.NET. The other reason is obviously you get your full control of your data access layer and you're not reliant on your SQL SharePoint lists. Now, the one limitation of SharePoint lists, which is a big one, which I hadn't touched on before, is around relational stuff. If you're looking at very highly normalized databases where you have lists and columns and third foreign keys and stuff, you should really be looking at keeping that data within SQL and not SharePoint lists. So therefore, if you're not going to be leveraging lists and you're not leveraging anything else in the SharePoint platform, the question to be is whether you should really be putting it there in the first place. The skinning in SharePoint is very powerful, but if you want full control over your user interface and how the markup's rendered and everything, you may just be simpler just to stick with ASP.NET if you don't have the time to learn how to manipulate the SharePoint interface. And I'd just like to put it out there are plenty of other web content management system products out there other than SharePoint, and if you know ASP.NET, there's lots of others you can leverage, such as .NET Nuke and other open source platforms, including the new Oxite one by Microsoft, which is very limited, but again, depending on what your requirements are, that might be more suited to you than SharePoint. So, in summary, SharePoint is just an extension of what you already know as an ASP.NET developer. SharePoint isn't going to go away. It's basis for a lot of Microsoft Server products now, including Team Foundation Server and Performance Point, which is now going to be swallowed up into SharePoint, and I imagine a lot more in the future to come as well. I believe, and I've seen lots of messages communicating this, that they do perceive SharePoint as being a development platform, and so it'd be interesting to see the synergies between ASP.NET and SharePoint moving forward. I would say though that you can only use it if you are going to need the features of SharePoint. Don't just put it in SharePoint and not actually leverage any of it, because you are going to add a complexity you don't use. So just bear that in mind, because you can always port that ASP.NET later on. And just go into a project if you are going to use SharePoint with an awareness of what features you are actually going to need. So hopefully that's give you a bit of an idea. I'd really appreciate some feedback on this presentation. There is a speakerrate.com website, which I'll provide a link to on the webcast where this is hosted, where I'd really appreciate if you could actually come in here and have a look at just adding some comments and a rating for this presentation, just to give me a feedback so that the next presentation I can do can better for the community. I really appreciate your time you've taken to do this. Feel free to check out my blog for those articles and the regular posts I keep on there, and also to have a look further at the SharePoint Development Wiki and what that can do for you guys. The company I work for, Redify, also run these virtual development network meetings, which focus not only in SharePoint but also ASP.NET and other .NET platform areas as well. So please feel free to hit up that website to look at what most recent presentations we've done. And I'm available on Twitter on jthake too, so keep in touch that way too.